Good afternoon, good morning, or possibly good evening, wherever you are tuning in from today. And thank you for joining the latest Service Department News webinar. A very popular and highly topical theme today, judging by the hundreds of you that have signed up. And today we're going to be talking about the policy shifts and regulation that are shaping service departments. My name's Eloise Hanson. I'm the editor of Service Department News, and we are an online trade publication. We cover the global service department, apart hotel, extended stay hotel, and serviced residence industry worldwide. A brief overview of how today's webinar is going to run. We'll spend around 45 minutes in discussion with our speakers today, and we will be taking some questions from the audience throughout today's conversation. So if you have anything pressing that you would like to ask or contribute to, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen or the chat function, and I will get round to including those as and where relevant. And just a reminder that today's webinar is being recorded. Every registrant will receive a copy of that recording along with a written summary of the key takeaways within 48 hours of this webinar finishing. And if you have time at the end, a short survey will appear on your screen when you leave the webinar. Any feedback is super important to us. We're always looking to improve wherever we can. So why are we here? Why are we talking about policy and regulation? And here's some stories that we've published recently on Service Department News, but also our sister publication, Short-Term Rentals. And we are seeing regulatory pressure continue to intensify globally. And this is from development all the way through to day-to-day operations. So in Singapore, planning policy is shaping the supply side of the market, with recent changes from the Urban Redevelopment Authority expanding the potential for hospitality conversion in certain precincts. So effectively widening that investor base or investor pool for potential hospitality projects. And in London, the leader of Westminster Council has written to Airbnb and Booking.com calling for stronger action against unlawful short-term rentals, with the council estimating that around 3,000 properties within Westminster are breaking the 90-day annual limit. And at a European level, a new EU-wide framework for short-term rentals could help to address some of these challenges, and it will require hosts to register with national authorities and obtain a unique identification number, which must be displayed on any listings across platforms such as Airbnb or Booking.com. And the aim here is to improve that transparency and give local authorities more consistent access to operational data. And on the next slide, alongside regulatory pressure, travel policies, so particularly entry requirements and visas, are also influencing demand. So in the United States, a BTN Group survey of corporate travel professionals highlights concerns around the proposed requirements for foreign visitors to disclose 5 years of social media history. And around 41% of corporates said that they would reduce travel to the US if such measures were introduced. But in APAC, we're seeing a very different dynamic. In China, Silver Door data shows that an easing of entry requirements is actually driving stronger demand across primary and secondary cities, with inquiries up 36% and reservations doubling year on year. So there's lots happening through the full spectrum. And it's at this stage that I would very much like to ask our audience to get involved, to truly get stuck in and share their own thoughts, because I would be keen to know which area of regulation is having the biggest impact on your business. Is it planning or use cases or zoning rules happening in your local area? Is it short-term let caps or limits? Is it registration and or licensing? Something that I haven't covered in my context is operational compliance. I believe there's new EPC regulations coming through that will require commercial properties to, I believe, reduce or achieve a certain EPC rating, I think it might be C by 2030? Or is it having minimal impact? Who knows? So cast your votes. We will get round to showing those results at the end of the webinar. And whilst you're casting your votes, let's meet our panel. And I'm going to ask each to introduce themselves from left to right as per the screen. So James, let's kick off with you and welcome.
Thank you very much, Eloise, and good afternoon, evening, good morning, everybody. My name's James Foice. I'm the CEO of the Association of Service Department Providers, ASAP.
Thank you, James. And Nick, over to you. Welcome.
Thank you, Eloise. My name is Nick Estrada. I'm the CEO for the Corporate Housing Providers Association, or CHPA.
Brilliant, Nick. Thank you. And Jouke, over to you.
Hi, Louise. Thank you. My name is Jouke Baaima. I am actually wearing two hats today. I'm the co-founder of Corporate Housing Factory, which is a Dutch operator of service departments, and also the co-founder of YOSAA. It stands for Your Service Department Agency, an agency working in Europe.
Thank you, Jouke. And Matt, over to you.
I've got a couple of hats as well. I'm Deputy Chair of ASAP, but today I'm going to be talking in my capacity as CEO of City Apartments, which is a service department company in London, specialising in corporate accommodation, and also CEO of Ando Living UK, which is a European hospitality company that bought City Apartments a couple of years ago.
Super. And now I'm going to kick off by asking you all the same question. I worry if we are able to get this down in one sentence, but let's give it a go. Because if you had to define corporate housing or service departments to a policymaker in a single sentence, how would you describe the product? And I will work reversely. So let's kick off with Matt, and then we'll go Jouke, Nick, and James.
I would say a legal, compliant and professionally managed space where the public stay.
Nice. Guys, you've got a tough gig here because that was short and concise. Jouke, over to you.
Yeah, I would say providing a housing option between a hotel and a conventional residential lease.
Yep. Nick, your thoughts?
I get a little longer, but I use a lot of commas here. So corporate housing, we would define as a professionally managed, fully furnished, short to medium term accommodation designed to provide a fully residential experience for people who need a temporary home rather than a hotel stay. And that provides consistency, duty of care, and service tailored to business travelers, project teams, relocating employees, and others in transition.
And I will give it to you. That did sound like one sentence, just a long sentence. So
great. Thank you.
And James, how would you describe it?
There's clearly a lot of thought gone into this, and we've been discussing this for many, many years. But what I do when I speak to policymakers is try and have them visualize a spectrum of accommodation. And I think Jouke talked about this, but at one end of the spectrum, you've got the apart hotel product, which is a conventional C1 style hotel, apart hotel, right through to the residential end. And the professionally managed service department product sits within that spectrum. And it's important to talk about professionalism and credibility within that dialogue as well.
I think one thing that you've all mentioned in your description was professionally managed. So we'll definitely pick up on that later today. Okay, Nick, I'm going to come to you now. Because in my context, I try to give that global, I suppose, case study of what is happening around the world. And from your perspective, which global region do you think is currently setting the direction for regulation, and more importantly, why?
Yeah, I think in a lot of my conversations with our members or my colleagues on the call today, even, I don't think it comes as a surprise. I think that region is probably Europe. I think, as you mentioned, that there are obviously regulations or conversations that are happening in other parts of the world, North America included. But I think when we see the concerted effort around these kinds of regulations, registration schemes, taxation, those kinds of things, I think we're really seeing those conversations happening in Europe. I think a key component of those, in my opinion, is related to the short-term rental industry. I think as well over the last decade, I think we've seen some good conversations around over tourism, and obviously how short-term rentals potentially support the view maybe of some places or destinations that is happening. Again, I think short-term rentals absolutely have their place in the accommodation market. I think then where the concern around these regulations, at least in my perspective, comes from is then that misunderstanding of our sector, right? Is they're not really understanding who we are. They see a problem. And again, I think that there are some legitimate concerns at times about what they are trying to solve. But I think often the direction in which they are trying to solve is trying to treat accommodations as a singular entity. And as James just mentioned, as others have mentioned, right, there's a spectrum of what these accommodations look like. And so really trying to make sure that they understand that we are a very different sector than, you know, an individual Airbnb host who may want to have a unit available in their city. And so really kind of working with that. And I think the other side of that, outside of accommodations for tourists or you know, very short-term travelers, is this belief that, again, our industry is taking a lot of affordable housing stock off of the long-term rental market. And I think, at least in North America, where I've seen this, where some regulations have come through that are specifically meant to address that, the long-term impact we can see is that it has had no impact on the long-term rental market or the cost of housing in the locations. And in reality, all it has done is impact and harm the local economy. And so I think really being able to have those conversations with regulators is important. But again, I think it comes down to, again, they're trying to solve a problem, but there's a misunderstanding at the end of the day of what our industry is.
I would like you to explore that misunderstanding in some greater detail, Nick, because what exactly is it that policymakers are not understanding about the corporate housing and extended stay sector? Like, what is causing so much confusion?
I think it is that the short-term rental market has created a brand, in my opinion, right? That it is so identifiable. It is easy to, and honestly, at some level, I think the short-term rental is very easy to understand, right? It's kind of like a hotel, but it's an apartment or it's a house instead. And I think when folks think about that, again, the kind of traveler who would use that is much easier. Again, vacation rentals, I think, as well, have been around for a long time. I think the challenge is, and again, I've had this conversation with a lot of folks in North America, is you've likely never heard of our industry because we've also never caused a lot of problems, right? So we've been highly compliant. Again, you'll remember in my one sentence, right? Consistency, duty of care. Those are really important components, I think, for our industry because of the clientele that our operators often work with. Just earlier this week, Matt and I were talking, and you know, again, the duty of care is so important. We want a corporate traveler wants their traveler in a compliant unit because what the worst thing that could happen, right, is that is not a compliant unit, and now that traveler has to be relocated or has to be moved or comes home and the locks on their door have been changed or something, right? And so we want to make sure that we're not doing those things. And I think that the level of, again, the professionally managed piece that needs to come in is a little confusing, I think, sometimes for regulators when they start to think, wait, you mean there's more to this than just putting your unit up on a website and people can buy it. And so I think that really walking them through who's using the product, how it's impacting the local economy, the kinds of use cases that might be needed. Again, it's a lot more nuanced than just, well, you're doing it for less than a 12-month stay, so obviously it's a short-term rental.
James, I'm curious whether what Nick has shared about his experience, particularly in North America, is being echoed or mirrored in your conversations here in the UK. Is it very similar or different?
Yes, no, it is very similar, and I think awareness is causing the majority of the challenges around some of the legislation that we're seeing. And we've talked a lot about statutory registration that's coming, and we were lucky enough to meet with the department within government that are overseeing that at the moment. There's DCMS here in the UK. And it's very clear when we speak to government officials that they don't, I say, that spectrum of accommodation, and we sit somewhere in it. Professionally managed organisations sit somewhere in it. But they're very clear or the misconception is within the policymakers that the hotel world is very easily understood. The left-hand end of the spectrum that I was talking about, the C1 stuff, the apart hotels, it's really clearly understood. It's got reception desks, it's got housekeeping provision, it might have other services related to a hotel. That stuff is very easily understood. Where it gets complicated is where we've talked about the length of stay, the residential elements of the product. And what we've been able to do in these conversations is talk to these policymakers about the complexities a little bit, and it stopped them. And it's been really quite rewarding because they saw it as Nick said, short-term rentals. So without the conversations, I think we would have been in a really tricky position, because short-term rentals is at one end of the spectrum, according to policymakers, and that is deemed to be a whole world of murk, which is misunderstood and not really understood to any extent. And then you've got the bona fide style apart hotel products, which are clearly understood. And I think the motivation, well, I don't think, we know that the motivation to introduce statutory registration in England and in Wales was around cleaning up and making the sector safer. So that was the motivation initially, and we applaud that. We think it's absolutely fantastic that there are efforts now underway within England and Wales to introduce a scheme that is going to have participants declaring that they have certain criteria when it comes to operating, such as insurances, health and safety policies, fire risk protocols in place, and so on. So from a positive perspective, we think that that's really good. But of course, it gets very complicated.
Not wanting to overcomplicate a very complicated situation anyway, but something that I was trying to research in preparation for this webinar was how that proposed national registration scheme will interact with something like London's 90-day rule. And James, from your conversations that you've had just recently, what does that truly look like in practice, or how do you think that is going to evolve in practice?
I think it's two separate entities completely. So 90-day rule was around, I think, 10, 11 years ago, which was introduced to allow individuals and organisations in London predominantly to let out a spare bedroom, and they could do that up to a period of time. And of course, it is up to 90 days. That continues. Now, that's evolved into individuals and organisations offering their entire buildings or apartments up to a period of 90 days. So nothing's changed about that. That continues. And if organisations exceed that 90-day period, then technically they're in breach of that 90-day rule. So for our members and the professional service department industry, all of them will exceed that 90-day rule. So technically it doesn't impact on them. And if they're not exceeding 90 days, they're probably not very profitable. Conversely, the registration scheme is a scheme that is identifying, and this is the conversations we've had this week, will identify organisations that don't sit within that left-hand end of the spectrum, as I refer to it. So the hotel C1 style apart hotel products, those are going to be exempt from the scheme. So everybody else that operates within a residential environment predominantly, that will include operators within the C3 world, operators that are operating residential, irrespective of how long that length of stay is, will be in scope and will need to register each apartment within the registration scheme. And we understand, I have to be careful now because this hasn't been confirmed, but we understand there will be a flat fee per year, per key, to upload an apartment onto the registration scheme. And should that operator wish to advertise through a conventional booking platform, such as an OTA or an Airbnb model, then they must provide that individual unique registration number. So essentially, if an organisation is advertising that sits within a residential model and doesn't have a unique registration number, they're in breach of what will become law at some point over the next 6 months. So as you know, we've been fighting for credibility, professionalism, professionally managed service departments. So for ASAP and the industry and all of our agent partners, this is a good thing, because this is now identifying or differentiating, let's use that term, organizations that comply with a desire to want to professionalize their product versus those that don't. So 90-day rule and registration shouldn't have an impact.
Taking into consideration potential costs of compliance, do you think that with this incoming regulation, particularly around the national registration scheme, that we will see operators pivot to comply with the new rules or leave the market entirely? How do you see this rolling out?
I wish you hadn't asked me that. That's a really difficult question, isn't it? I'm not going to lie and say that the future of the industry looks really rosy. I think that there is going to be some challenges and some headwinds ahead, and those will be cost related. In fact, we're seeing them within the UK now. So within the residential world, we're seeing doubling of council tax. And that doubling of council tax is technically identifying product that is second homeowners, therefore vacant properties, potentially in some markets around the UK. And the motivation here, and this we must understand, the motivation for that legislation is to release more housing back into the housing stock. So I suspect within the residential side of things, so the C3 world, there will be more hurdles to look at, there will be more challenges to look at, and probably increased cost, certainly within England and Wales, and potentially in Scotland, where we're seeing licensing already, and in different markets in Europe and so forth. The result of that inevitably will be some organisations choosing not to continue in the capacity that they are. We've seen that over the last 6 months. But of course, investigate possibly other models, which might be longer stay bookings, AST rental opportunities, all sorts of other things. So rather than looking at this as a negative perspective, I think we as an industry will pivot, because we've always done it that way, and we'll look for new opportunities and look at ways of navigating the policies that are coming.
Thanks, James. I'd like to bring the conversation to Matt now, to talk about the sort of boots on the ground, how regulation is actually impacting those day-to-day operations for you. Matt, can you share any insights here, please?
I mean, I think the starting point is, I completely agree with James in terms of for the good actors in our industry, further regulation and compliance is a good thing. But as a starting point, our industry really isn't regulated at all at the moment. So you really, there's very low barrier to entry to call yourself a service department. You would probably go through more checks and balances if you were trying to rent an apartment on an AST. And so if you're renting something through an estate agent, you would need to give gas safety certificate, PAT testing, electricity certificate, things like that. And really, you don't need to do any of those things to call yourself a service department company, which, when you think about it from a duty of care and compliance point of view, it's extraordinary. And I think the industry has developed so quickly in so many different ways over the years, from a governance point of view, because it's a very fragmented industry and it has a confusing and quite nuanced planning class within that. It's been very difficult to govern that in an appropriate way. And so they've introduced things like the 90-day rule and things like that to try and have some control or some oversight, but it's very little. So I think on one hand, there's the regulation side, which is really, I think there should be a benchmark. If you have the public staying with you, you need to ensure that you're offering a safe space. And then there's the registration side, which is obviously what James is talking about, and is going to be the big step change in our industry. And I've been involved for 20 odd years in the sector, and it's changed enormously. In London, it started off with mainly the likes of Oakwood and Bridge Street, who were operating C3, which are residential units, effectively, and they were mirroring what Nick represents in the States, which is corporate housing. So bigger apartments, more residential feeling for extended stays for corporates. They would want to need the bigger space because they're here for longer, and they would want a company or a brand to run that because they felt it was safer than finding a random individual apartment for their travellers. Over the years, because that barrier to entry is quite low, you can effectively go and rent either a block or an individual unit with a residential license. In the old days, stick in Wi-Fi and call yourself a serviced apartment. That has introduced a lot of companies and individuals into that space. And then probably 10 and a bit years ago is when the apart hotel model really developed. And that's the C1 model, which is much closer to the apartment model. And that was really born out of the investor landscape, where they wanted an institutional asset to be able to invest in, which was quite different to the more traditional C3 residential style asset class. So I think to bring it up to now, where is it going to affect the industry? Well, I think any regulation, I suppose, is really designed to look after the vulnerable, you could say, so therefore the guests, to make sure that they're in a safe space, and it's to root out the bad actors. So I think any good organization should welcome registration. Any good organization with nothing to hide should be absolutely getting involved with ASAP and supporting that direction of travel, because this is where it's going, and it's much better to be part of that conversation, help shape our future industry. But I think for operators themselves, it will be challenging. I think we're already seeing lots of challenges generally, whether it's with the economy, whether it's with the cost of delivering what we do as businesses. But I think for those who operate in the C3 space, that will either be operating a whole building as a C3, or it will be operating individual units in a mixed-use building. And I think what the registration scheme will do will provide a point at which you have to comply with certain things from a safety and compliance point of view, which is good. But then I think the ripple effect from the registration is the fact this will be a public register, and DCMS will be in introducing this registration scheme. But after that, it's going to be the Ministry of Housing or local councils who are actually going to be using the scheme to manage our sector in the way they want to. And I think those operating in C3 buildings will then be forced more to comply with the 90-day rule if it's in London. They will likely introduce something similar in the regions to have some kind of standardized way of monitoring this space. But I think for operators in the C3 side of the sector, it's a real problem, because their landlords will soon probably not be able to get finance on their building if the tenant isn't complying with the registration. Corporate clients, we're a corporate service department company. For the last couple of years, the very engaged clients have been asking about whether your building is legal and whether you're complying, and I think that will only continue. Local governments have big housing targets to meet, and that they've realized they're not going to meet that through new builds. So they will take back C3 buildings, they will enforce enforcement notices, and those buildings they take back from short-term rental operators will be classed as new homes as part of their target. So I think they will be motivated to do that. Obviously, the cost of registration will be an extra cost for operators to think about. And then I think, generally speaking, external eyes, investors, people looking to buy operating businesses or invest in these buildings will think twice, because technically you are not using the right use class. So I think it's going to take, like most of these things, time to wash through. But the registration scheme will unfortunately, it will be a blunt enough instrument, and it won't be nuanced enough to probably properly tackle the problem. But they have to start from somewhere. And I think we've seen that with the council tax premium issue, where a couple of very localized policies for places like Cornwall and the Lake District was then used by every other borough and council, if they saw fit, to raise some revenue. And I think that will be part of the
Thank you, Matt. I'm going to pick up on Matt's point around the corporate client side, and I'm going to bring Jouke into the conversation here, wearing one of his two hats, as you have an agency. And I mentioned in the context slides that we are starting to see how policies are shaping that corporate demand, and where corporates are sending their travellers. Firstly, I want to talk about distribution and how increased regulations such as the National Register will start to shape the way that service department inventory is ultimately distributed and managed. Can you share any insights as to around perhaps any trends or conversations that you're currently seeing, Jouke?
Yeah, and I think that Matt and James has touched upon it already, is that I think the positive side of a register is that it can help to build trust. To see that, I think that in Barcelona, I think that you have to show the numbers, so that gives a little bit of trust that somebody is watching, and you as a client know that you're staying in a compliant apartment. But I think that the key is what do you do with that definition? What do you do with that register? If nothing is behind it, then you still don't know if it's compliant, if it's safe, if it's trustworthy. And I think that that's something that's still not there. And I think that Matt just mentioned that as well, is that it's not just only about control, but it's also about, so what is it that we want to put in that number, in that national register? Is it just only to register which apartments have been applied for service department or for corporate housing units? Or is it also to almost define a new asset class? And I think that if you look at the example we have here in the Netherlands, is that some of the cities, they're really rigid. They really want to control the inventory just to get service departments back into the regular conventional residential space. I think that that's a bad thing, obviously. But you also have cities where the municipality is looking for that cooperation to say, hey, we recognize the need for service departments. We recognize the need for temporary housing, because I think that product is really helping the infrastructure to attract companies, to attract multinationals who, have got a added value to the economy of that region. And they're willing to help and work together with service department operators. So I think on the good side, it definitely can help shape and form that trust in the industry. And I think that that's something that can also help, if we look from an agency standpoint, And I think that James and Nick will agree with me that if you look at membership of CHPA or membership of the ASAP in Europe, is that all that we want is that we want to professionally manage and help our clients, and not just to be, on the illegal side of life. I think that's something that a national register can definitely help forming that.
Please forgive me if I've totally got this wrong, but did Amsterdam or broadly the Netherlands try to cap or define service departments by length of stay? And has that worked or not worked?
Yeah, actually this year it's went from 30 days to 15 days in Amsterdam, maximum number of days that you can rent out. But that's really on the, as we call that, on the short-term rental. So that's really on the I would call it the tourist side of life. And there are only a few operators left on that professional managed buildings. Yeah, that's definitely correct. You have to have, so Amsterdam knows a little bit like, if you compare it to the UK, almost like a C5 solution out there. So that's helping, because there you see that the municipality or the local authorities are helping to create that infrastructure.
And given all these changes, I imagine that in some cases demand might be displaced elsewhere. It might actually pivot some, be it corporates or possibly even leisure travelers, to look elsewhere. And Jouke, I'm curious whether you're seeing any general changes in demand in response to these regulatory changes and regulatory new additions.
Yeah, and I think that what we shouldn't forget, that doesn't have anything to do with the planning law. However, what you see is one is the VAT increase in the Netherlands on any hospitality product, by the way, went from 9% up to 21%. And for Amsterdam in particular, that we're going to increase the tourist tax just once more. So eventually, in a couple of years' time, the prediction or the proposition is that 41% out of every euro coming into hospitality Amsterdam is going to be paid to tax. That doesn't really, I'm not a marketer, but I think that's something that, I think that's something that is not a very positive thing to, for your business climate. You get the name of that, you're becoming too expensive for MITE's industry, but also for companies wanting to settle down in the Amsterdam region.
I was going to flag this at the end of my webinar, and I'm still going to flag it at the end of the webinar, but I'll mention it now. The next webinar that I'm hosting is on June the 22nd, and it's all about the tourist tax, and it's looking at what does this mean for England's operators, and we're going to be learning about what's happened in Amsterdam specifically. We're going to be taking a look at what's happening in Edinburgh, all with the view as to what does the realities look like for any hospitality operator, be it hotel, service department, or short-term rental, should this be rolled out across the UK. So stay tuned, guys, because there is more coming on that later. Moving on, and I'm taking a look at some of these poll results, and we'll share these results right at the end. But whether you're surprised or not to hear this, but short-term let caps has topped the rankings in terms of the biggest regulation that is having an impact on businesses currently. And I'd like to come to Nick, if I may, because we try as much as we can and as best as we can to track what is happening worldwide when it comes to short-term rental enforcement. And in US cities where there is quite a strict regulation around short-term rentals, are you seeing, to my point about Jouke with displaced demand, has corporate housing benefited from this, or are these providers being pulled into that same regulatory net?
Yeah, I think great question, Eloise. I think in some areas, yes. In some areas, no, right? I'll expand a little bit more to the US and Canada. Over the last couple of years, we've actually seen some bigger fights, I guess I'll say legislatively in Canada than we have necessarily in the US. The one that really comes to mind around demand shifting and what I guess I'll call unintended consequences, right, of some of these laws. British Columbia put in a day cap, right? So you couldn't have anything less than, and I'm blanking whether it's 180 or 90 right now. I think it is still 90. But you couldn't do it, right? And I think the law was written in such a way that it was like you couldn't knowingly, right, have a shorter term stay than that. And so obviously there's some, some contractual language, obviously, I'm sure that you can add into agreements. But what was interesting is, the speed at which that happened. It was about 2 weeks from introduction to law. And so, right, the ability to even get in front of that or to respond at all was very difficult. But what we found in the conversations afterward is there was then some openness to understanding again what the industry is. But then I would say a few months after the law passed and was enacted, as unfortunately is the case, it seems in the summers here, some forest fires were hitting, and there was a request to many of our member companies in the area to provide insurance housing, right? So support for displaced citizens, not even guests, right? In terms of, as we think about one of the sectors that I know corporate housing can really support. And the response, unfortunately, right, that we had to often provide, many of our companies had to say, at least to the government officials, right, was, well, no, we can't do that because you legislated away our ability to support local citizens. So can you work with us, right, to continue to try to address the breakdown, again, back to you were trying to solve something, but this does not seem to allow for other support and other kind of nuanced conversations. I think, again, around a lot of these where you are seeing demand shifting back to the corporate housing space is where there has been a clear understanding, or at least an appetite to understand the distinction between traditional short-term rental and the corporate housing space. In the US specifically and in Canada as well, again, I would say the inventory model is, as I think Matt has mentioned, is a little different, right? We can scale up and scale down very quickly. However, these laws have definitely created, I think, some hesitancy and risk, or being a little more risk averse, right? I'm not going to go and take a lot of units out if I am unsure if I'm going to fill them. And if, who knows, in 6 months from now, right now, I'm actually not even legally allowed to rent them out. But again, going back to the distinction and again, the good actors who are willing to follow and be compliant, I think they see that as a winning quality, obviously, then for their businesses as they are able to showcase, again, back to that duty of care, how they can provide the necessary stays for those that are there. So I think, again, as I'll always keep pushing on the difference there, really trying to highlight those and make sure that, at least on our side, that our members are following the compliance and the laws that they are supposed to be doing, because that, I think, again, some of these, right, if we look at the short-term rental space, right, come from a lack of a willingness for that industry to regulate itself. And so I think, again, if we can come together, create some standards that we support, I think there is openness from governments to say, we are willing to work with you.
Mm-hmm. I'm gonna make a call to the audience because there's 15 minutes left on the clock. So if you guys have any questions for our panelists, do submit these now, and I will do my best to weave these in as soon as I can. Nick, staying with you for a moment, because hearing that case study around what happened in British Columbia and a 2 week timeline from something being discussed to it being pushed into law. Question for you, how are these, given the speed of change and given the speed at which this regulatory landscape is evolving, how is it affecting your role and what you do? Like how are you truly staying abreast of everything that is happening, whilst, to your point, trying to get in front of the right people at the right time to have that open, mature, useful conversation?
Yeah, I think the plea I make, obviously, to our members often is to share things when they are happening, right? It is, I think, at this point probably impossible for myself to be knowledgeable of every single regulation that is happening, as the others have shared at this point. Housing, and I think around the world in many places, is pretty local, right? We give control of that to the individuals that live in those places, and those individuals, and I think at some levels rightly so, should make decisions about how their homes and their residential spaces evolve. What that does, though, is that makes it very difficult for our rules, right? Again, in the US specifically, I can say there are a lot of things that are managed federally or at the national level. Housing, again, as I mentioned, is not one of those, right? So whereas in the association space, many of my counterparts in other industries can just go to Washington and have a conversation with 2 or 3 individuals and really influence and change policy. That is a lot more difficult, so again, specifically speaking in the United States, just regarding the structure we have. And so always asking for things that are coming up, obviously trying to do as much reading as we can. I think when you share things that are coming up or things that are impacting your businesses, the ability to understand the financial impact or, Matt, as you mentioned, right, just the compliance challenges. I think that's always a big thing we like to talk about with regulators is you've created this extremely complex regulation scheme. Our members, our operators going to be able to do that. Also, do you have the enforcement processes on your side to actually enforce this potentially very complex process? San Francisco ran into this in 2020. I think they put in a cap. They said they would have 1,000 intermediary length occupancy units. Even today, I think less than 200 have been approved because the process for approval for an ILO permit in San Francisco is extremely onerous. It actually has to be done by the building owner, not by the presenter. So I think, again, just they're all so unique, so nuanced. And so I think continuing to partner with operators in those individual locations to understand how it's impacting and really kind of being a strategy alongside them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Nick. Getting some questions from the audience, so I'm going to add these in very quickly, and then we'll finish off with some questions to all of you to get your thoughts on where the industry is heading. Okay, so question for Matt/James. As I understand things, post-registration operators will be given a unique code to use on OTAs, and the OTAs will permit 90 days short letting. How will companies like Silverdoor and other offline non-live availability platforms be affected, if at all?
Shall I take that one? Because that was a direct question I asked of DCMS on Tuesday of this week, Ben. So really appropriate question. And Nick was talking about unintended consequences here. And this is one of those things completely, because the unique registration code is required to advertise an apartment through the OTA, as you suggest. And what will happen is if that unique registration code is incorrect, or it is being advertised inappropriately, either from the OTA's perspective or the operator's perspective, there will be fines involved. So there is a scheme administrator involved in overseeing the application of the registration scheme. So I asked the question, how does that work within our world, whereby individual apartments aren't necessarily advertised through our corporate travel agents? And the response was really interesting. So DCMS said to us that there wasn't a requirement for those corporate agents to publish the unique registration code. However, it might be very good practice for them to ask for it in order to differentiate professionally managed serviced apartments from those that weren't within our world anyway. And I thought that was a really interesting response, and it's something ASAP will take up. So we believe that registration is a good thing to professionalize the sector. It's another check and balance that comes into the whole process, which we think is really important and will drive away some of those less scrupulous operators. So for now, the understanding is that corporate agents will not need to advertise a unique registration number for that apartment. But I would urge them all to ask the question of those operators, because that drives credibility, professionalism, and trust into the accommodation spectrum.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, James. Nick?
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think the offline online non-live availability conversation is interesting because we are seeing that in some cities in North America right now of, again, really trying to target that platform style of booking. And so I think we've seen in some places some operators who've made the decision of we are showing a catalog of potentially available, right? Or that is representative of our portfolio, but is not the individual, to James's point, right? Is not the individual apartment that you may be staying in, right? This is a photo of what a standard 2-bedroom apartment might look like. But in order to book, you can't book that online. You're going to have to speak with one of our agents or our reservation team. And so some conversations, I think, certainly around that in terms of live availability, which I know that there is a movement that I think a lot of operators would love to get to that point, but that may also open us up to then now we are included in some of these regulations that are starting to pop up in some cities.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Nick. Back to you, James.
Just really quickly, back on Ben's point there. I don't know that there will necessarily be a loophole for operators that sit within the residential space, because the scheme administrator will be looking for proof that they have registered effectively. So those that sit within the scope of the scheme are the ones that don't operate a credible, recognized C1 style apart hotel product. Everybody else will need to register, and at some point that scheme administrator will have the capability of, I'm going to use the term, auditing the process. So
thank you. A final question from the audience, and I think I'll share this one with the operators on the panel. So Jouke and Matt, how do you feel that some of this regulation will affect corporate relocation and broadly mobility partners who might use serviced accommodation and perhaps BTR properties or occasionally Airbnb and Booking.com currently? Would either Jouke or Matt be able to share their thoughts onto what might happen with their partners that are actually putting demand into their properties?
I mean, I think it will have an impact to the responsible players in the market. I mean, the important distinction for us to remember is that the registration scheme is not just to make sure that people are registering and making sure that there's a compliant register of those who operate short term. It's also to, in some way, regulate the correct use of that planning class. And so I think if you've only got, let's say, 90 days where you're allowed to short let, whether that's lots of individual nights or a 2-month booking, to make money beyond that 90-day period will be very difficult with all of the other challenges that go on in our space and the cost of delivering that product. And so I think, slightly looping in the previous question about the corporate booking agents, I think this is a starting point where they can't legislate and think through every eventuality and nuance in our industry. But I think it will end up being almost a pincer-like movement where the different stakeholders involved in this ecosystem, of which the relocation companies are and the corporates are, they will begin saying to their relocation companies or their travel agents, can you ensure this is a registered and compliant operator, please? And there will be registration numbers for the individual units, but there'll also be registration numbers for the operators themselves. And so I think it will then be, it will then end up being a market-driven result, because we as operators or anyone involved in our space will have to go and ensure they're compliant, but also make sure that we are responding to what the market's demanding. And if the corporates are saying, look, we have to ensure that we're not putting ourselves at risk of liability by putting one of our employees in an apartment which isn't compliant, that will most likely over time shut down that side of things. So I think it's just trying to step through, and I think that's the shame with this registration as it's currently being mooted. It's a bit of a blunt instrument, and it's penalizing in some way the good actors in the C3 space because of the planning class issue, not because they're not good operators. But unfortunately, and we might come on to this later if there's time, but that obviously we've got to get the licensing right to allow for this flex in the market, so everyone can operate in this space.
I just want to add, if that's okay, Louise. I mean, easy way out is to say, okay, I completely agree with you, Matt, and I do agree. And maybe it's also interesting to look at from an agency, wearing the agency hat, is that I think that all parties and all partners should really work together to build that trust, because nobody wants to have a client, being lost in a non-compliant or criminal building. And I think that keywords like vet your inventory, build that trust, build that relation, whether you are a corporate client, whether you're an agent or you're an operator, together with the trade bodies, and especially like the ASAP and CHPA, to have that trust and that communication, to help authorities build a good register or scheme or anything that can take out the illegal side of the industry.
I'm gonna click share results of the poll results here, and I'm hoping that this will show on your screen. So I asked earlier, which area of regulation is having the biggest impact on your business? 45% voted for short-term let caps. Behind, in second place, 34% voted for registration or licensing, followed by 24% planning/use class rules, 16% operational compliance, and then 13% having minimal impact. So certainly touches on quite a lot of what we've been talking about today. I can see that it's 3 o'clock UK time, but I have some final questions that I just want to nip around the panel really quickly, because it's been such a brilliant conversation. It'll be a shame to not ask these questions. So firstly, and I must stress, we will be quick on this. I want to ask all of you, how realistic is a global standardization for the service department sector? It's almost like a yes or no. Is it realistic or is it not realistic? And I'll go from left to right as per the screen. So James, your thoughts?
No. Unfortunately, I don't think it is realistic. We've been trying for 15 years to standardize the product in some way. And sorry, I'm talking more than I should do, but once interpretation of legislation is so varied around the world, we as a product are having to find a way of navigating all of that. So I think we're a long way off that.
Nick?
I would agree. I don't think it's possible globally, but I think we can, as an industry, further develop stronger definitions, common principles, our approach to the work we do.
Jouke, your thoughts?
No, I agree. I don't think it's possible, but I think it would be good to build some sort of foundation to define the class a little bit better.
And Matt, your thoughts?
Yeah, agreed. I mean, you can see the difference between England and Scotland, and then places like Portugal, and where they offer temporary licenses and things like that. So I think it's going to be almost impossible. But I would echo absolutely Nick's comments in terms of just trying to get the definitions right, the governance right, some common thread, because ultimately the guest is the same guest, whether they're staying in London or New York or Amsterdam. It's a guest that needs a safe space.
Agreed.
And finally, this might be a one-word answer, but it certainly follows on. If you had to redesign policy for service departments, what would you simplify first? And Nick, it suggested, I kind of figured that yours might be definition, but Nick, what would you say? What would you simplify?
Yes, I'm glad I've been clear on that message then. Yes, I do think definitions and again, those kind of governance structures of what we do. But I like Matt's comment there a lot of, at the end of the day, right? We all serve the same person, and that's the guest. And so that doesn't change who, it just changes how. So yeah, definitions, I think, for sure.
James, what would you simplify?
I think it's a propensity to understand the value of the sector and what that contributes to each individual market. And the conversations we've had with policymakers are simply not interested in those conversations. They're simply trying to recreate more housing stock so that can tick a deliverable as far as the manifesto that they introduced at the beginning of their tenure, unfortunately.
Jouke, what would you simplify?
I would echo definitely what Nick and Matt just said. It's all about the guest. Let's make that market a little bit more clear and work on that definition.
And Matt, your final thoughts?
Probably simplify it by making it a little bit more complicated at the beginning in order to simplify it. They need to appreciate that it's a very nuanced marketplace, and even you have C3 buildings with a sui generis short let license, which currently is going to be needing a registration, which is madness because it is a hotel. It is C1 in every. So they just need to understand the market a little better in order for us to better define it and therefore be able to move forward.
I wish we had more time. And there's a couple of questions that we haven't quite got around to asking. But thank you all so much for your contributions today. James, Nick, Jouke, Matt, you've all been brilliant. We're going to leave this webinar open right at the end, just to allow our audience members time to follow up on any of the links that we popped into the chat, including the LinkedIn profiles of all our speakers. So those where I didn't have time to ask your questions, do get in touch with our speakers directly. I'm sure they'll be happy to help. And there's just some final slides from me before I say a goodbye. I mentioned it earlier, England's tourist tax, what hospitality operators need to know. I'll be back on June the 22nd to discuss what that might look like realistically. The link to register has been popped into the chat. Would love to have you all there. And if you're interested in working with us across our digital events, such as these webinars, or perhaps our in-person events too, get in touch with my colleague Katie. Her details are on your screens and also popped into the chat. Once again, big thank you to our speakers. We've been having some great comments from the chat here. Thanks all, absolutely worthwhile webinar and great panel. So thank you, Tracy Kennedy, for those kind words. Wish you all well, good luck. I know it's tough out there. Keep striving, we are resilient, and we will be able to push this sector forwards. So thanks all for joining in. Take care and we'll see you all soon. Bye now.
At IHM, we believe in the power of connection. We exist to inspire, to inform, and to unite decision makers who are shaping the future of hospitality and real estate. Our why is simple. We believe this industry thrives when people and ideas come together. And we're here to make that happen. So how do we do it? We publish 4 leading multimedia brands, each a trusted voice in its sector. We blend intelligent content, curated events, and a strong community into everything we do, making it easy, accessible, and genuinely useful. From online engagement to face-to-face connection, we are known for being insightful, collaborative, and refreshingly human. We host world-class events, panel discussions, podcasts, award ceremonies, and webinars designed to spark ideas, drive conversation, and create impact. With over 62,000 monthly web visitors, 55,000 email subscribers, and 69,000 social media connections. Our reach is deep and our community is active. We're partnered with the biggest names in hospitality, and we'd love to connect with you. So whether you're looking to grow your visibility, meet the right people, or understand where the market's heading, read, watch, listen, and me. Do it all with IHM.